In August of 1940, in a quiet district of Mexico City, a murder occurred that shook the entire world. In a study, amidst books and papers, the strike of an ice axe shattered the skull of one of the most famous revolutionaries of the 20th century, Leon Trotsky. The killer was captured almost immediately, but the man who organized the operation remained hidden for decades. His name was Pavel Anatolievich Sudoplatov. For many years, he remained one of the most secret and influential officers of Soviet intelligence. A scout, an organizer of clandestine operations, and one of the most closed and influential officers of the Soviet secret services. He worked in a system where decisions were made in absolute silence, and the consequences of those decisions could alter the destinies of nations. His name almost never appeared in the newspapers. His name never appeared in history books. Even many high-ranking officials in the Soviet Union did not know exactly what this man did. Yet, it was he who coordinated one of the most daring operations of Soviet intelligence, the liquidation of Trotsky. It was his unit that participated in the procurement of the secrets of the American atomic project. Information that allowed the Soviet Union to create its own nuclear bomb and change the balance of power throughout the entire world. It was through his hands that the NKVD operations passed, those about which people preferred to remain silent for decades. His life is a journey from a boy in a provincial Ukrainian city to a man situated at the very center of the secret war of the 20th century. This is a story about the world of intelligence, about a world where betrayal and loyalty were sometimes separated by but a single errant step, about a world where decisions are made without witnesses, and often without the possibility of turning back. We shall attempt to unravel this grim, and we shall attempt to unravel this grim and labyrinthine biography, the biography of a man whose life proved to be closely intertwined with the most dangerous and secret pages of the history of the Soviet Union. Subscribe to the channel. Ahead of you lies a story in which there are almost no coincidences, only cold calculation, only secret operations, and the long shadow of a man named Pavel Sudoplatov. The boy from Melitopol. The southern city of Melitopol at the beginning of the 20th century. The small district center was lost between the steppes and the coast of the Sea of Azov. Dusty streets, the creak of carts, and the smell of bread from the bakeries. Here, in the ordinary family of a craftsman, in a house on the outskirts, on July the 15th, 1907, a boy was born who was destined to become one of the most enigmatic figures of Soviet intelligence. Pavel Anatolievich Sudoplatov. Few memories of his childhood have survived, and many of them are contradictory. The official biography claims that the family was poor but honest. The father was a master locksmith, and the mother was a homemaker. However, some declassified NKVD reports indicate that one of his distant relatives had connections with underground combat organizations during the Civil War. It is not excluded that it was through these connections that the young Pavel first heard stories of secret operations, conspiracy, and illegal contacts. In his childhood, he was distinguished by his powers of observation. Neighbors recalled, Pashka always listened more than he spoke. He loved to sit by the gate and watch who passed along the street, as if he were committing everything to memory. Later, these childhood habits would become part of his profession. The first years of the Revolution. When the Civil War began, Pavel was only 11 years old. Melitopol passed from hand to hand, the Whites, the Reds, the Makhnovists. Gunshots rang out from the streets, and carts hauled away the dead. This chaos became a school of survival for the boy. Later, in his memoirs, he recalled, We lived in a world where a person could vanish in a single night. In the morning, their relatives searched for them, and by the evening, no one was asking anymore. Thus we learned to remain silent and to notice every detail. There is a version that in those years, Pavel first found himself in underground contacts, helping Bolshevik scouts carry letters and giving warnings about punitive raids. In one of the archival reports of the Cheka for the year 1920, mention is made of a young courier, Pasha S., who saved a contact from arrest by warning him an hour before a raid. There is no proof that this was indeed Sudoplatov, but the coincidence of time and place is too precise to ignore. The path into the Cheka. After graduating from school, Pavel, who had barely reached the age of 16, set out for Kharkiv, the capital of Soviet Ukraine at the time. There, he entered courses at the local branch of the Cheka. The training was severe. Physical conditioning, marksmanship, hand-to-hand combat, and the fundamentals of agency work. The instructors often reminded the students that a Chekist has no future, only service and death, and that the primary weapon of a scout is not a pistol, but the ability to anticipate the actions of the enemy. According to the recollections of his fellow servicemen, Pavel did not stand out for his strength or height, but he struck them with his coolness. He easily passed psychological tests and could observe an object for hours without betraying any emotion. Already at the age of 18, they began to involve him in dangerous assignments: external surveillance, vetting traitors, and hunting for deserters. The first operations. One of the first known operations of Sudoplatov dates back to the year 1924. A Cheka report describes how a young agent, under the guise of a merchant's assistant, penetrated a den of smugglers who were supplying White Guard underground organizations with weapons. Pavel managed to relay information regarding the meeting place and the transport routes. In the end, the gang was liquidated, and the future scout was awarded a commendation. His name did not even enter official documents. This was the beginning of his true career as an invisible fighter. According to declassified materials, in those same years, he participated in a clandestine operation against emissaries of the Ukrainian insurgent army who were preparing an assassination of party leaders in Kharkiv. The details are still kept in the archive under the seal of secret. It is known only that Sudoplatov played the role of a liaison, transmitting false information which made it possible to prevent the attack. The tempering of a future master of special operations. By the end of the 1920s, the name of Pavel was known within the narrow circle of professional Chekists. He was valued for his ability to gain the trust of enemies, to remain invisible, and to fulfill an assignment at any cost. He himself would later say, "A Chekist is neither a hero nor a villain. He is an instrument. If it is necessary to kill, you kill. If it is necessary to save, you save. The main thing is the result." It was this hard, uncompromising logic that would define his entire subsequent life. From clandestine liquidations to the most famous operations of Soviet intelligence. The Young Liquidator. In the beginning of the 1930s, the name of Pavel Sudoplatov began to appear in the closed reports of the OGPU as a promising operative to whom cases were entrusted that required not only courage, but also cold calculation. He was still very young, just over 20. But he had already managed to go through the School of Street Intelligence, participated in surveillance, and conducted his first clandestine liquidations. His mentors were men who had gone through the Civil War, legendary Chekists who taught young agents to act without noise, to leave a minimum of traces, and never to allow hesitation. In the operational reports of that time, it was frequently mentioned that Employee S manifests an unusual coolness in solving tasks of increased complexity, and this was a great rarity for his age. First Blood Sudoplatov rarely spoke of his first direct killing. In his memoirs, there is only a single phrase: "After that day, I understood that I would no longer be able to return to an ordinary life." According to archival data, this occurred in the year 1928, when the Chekists identified a liaison of white émigré organizations who was preparing a series of terrorist attacks in Kharkiv. Pavel acted as part of a capture group, but it was to him they entrusted the task of being the first to enter the apartment where the suspect was hiding. Almost no eyewitness accounts have been preserved, but the operational note states, "The suspect offered armed resistance. Liquidation was carried out by Agent S under conditions of immediate threat to life." Later, colleagues recalled that the young Chekist emerged from the apartment pale but calm, and the first thing he did was demand to check the left-behind documents and maps of the conspirators. Since then, the attitude toward him changed. The leadership understood that he possessed the primary quality of a scout liquidator: the readiness to act instantly, without looking back at doubts or fear. He himself later admitted that it was this very day that became the point of no return. "I understood that the road back was closed. Now I was part of this machine, and no exit from it existed." Operations against Ukrainian nationalists. The end of the 20s and the beginning of the 30s were a time of fierce confrontation between the Soviet authorities and the underground of Ukrainian nationalists, which was closely connected with émigré centers in Poland and Romania. These groups planned terrorist attacks against party workers, organized the killings of activists, and orchestrated explosions on the railway. In Kiev, Odessa, and Kharkiv, entire cells of the underground operated, supplied with weapons and money from abroad. The young Sudoplatov, having already recommended himself in Kharkiv, was involved in the most risky operations. His task was not only surveillance, but also infiltration. Under the guise of a courier, he penetrated underground apartments, delivered fake parcels, and intercepted important dispatches. The agent's cover story often changed. One time he was a simple craftsman, another time a former white guard searching for work in émigré circles. In one assignment in the year 1929, he played a key role in uncovering a conspiracy that was preparing an assassination of the chairman of the Provincial Executive Committee. It was his information that allowed the Chekists to detain the terrorists at the moment of the bomb's delivery. Archival documents from those years, declassified only after the collapse of the USSR, confirm. On the account of the young Sudoplatov, there were no fewer than 3 major operations to destroy the nationalist underground. But in the reports, his name always figured under a cipher. Only a narrow circle knew who exactly was hiding behind the dry phrasing. The employee manifested personal bravery and ensured the success of the measure. These years tempered his character and taught him the primary rule of underground warfare. Mistakes are not forgiven, and there must be no extra witnesses. Sudoplatov was becoming that very man to whom people turned when it was required to do the work quietly, quickly, and without the right to fail. And even though he was only a little over 20, he was already perceived as an experienced liquidator, capable of taking on missions from which older colleagues would demur. The elimination of Konovalets. By the beginning of the 1930s, Pavel Sudoplatov had already become a figure whom the Lubyanka treated with special attention. Behind him lay a series of successful operations against Ukrainian nationalists, which made him a suitable candidate for performing tasks of exceptional importance. And one of such tasks appeared in the year 1938, when the leadership of the NKVD made the decision to liquidate Yevhen Konovalets, the leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, who was in emigration and actively cooperating with German intelligence. Konovalets was considered an extremely dangerous enemy of the Soviet Union. Under his leadership, combat groups were being formed, planned for use in a future war against the USSR. He coordinated terrorist attacks on the territory of Ukraine, recruited radicals, and established connections with the Polish secret services and the German Abwehr. The Lubyanka decided to deliver a surgical strike, depriving the nationalists of their primary organizer. Sudoplatov was summoned to Moscow and, in a narrow study, was presented with the plan of the operation that was destined to enter the history of the Soviet secret services. Lavrenti Beria personally defined the goal. The liquidation of Konovalets is a task of state importance. Accomplish it, and the road for the most complex operations abroad will open. The method of execution had to be not only effective, but also exclude any traces leading back to Moscow. Pavel was assigned to play the role of a Ukrainian nationalist, an émigré ready to join the OUN. Through verified channels, he established contact with the inner circle of Konovalets, managed to gain their trust, and arranged a personal meeting with the leader of the organization. The decisive day arrived on May the 23rd, 1938. The location, Rotterdam, a neutral territory where Konovalets felt relatively safe. Sudoplatov arrived at the meeting with a gift box of chocolate candies, inside of which was concealed an explosive device with a delayed mechanism. According to the plan, the bomb was supposed to go off several minutes after the delivery, when the agent had already left the meeting place. The conversation lasted about half an hour. Sudoplatov, portraying the recruitment of new supporters, discussed the possibilities of underground work on the territory of Ukraine, delivered important documents, and spoke of false connections in Kharkiv and Kiev. When he held out the box, Konovalets did not suspect anything was amiss. 15 minutes after Sudoplatov went out into the street, an explosion thundered. Konovalets perished instantly, and the police who arrived at the scene for a long time could not understand how the liquidation had been conducted. The official reports of the Dutch authorities spoke of a mysterious explosion that occurred right in the hands of the leader of the Ukrainian nationalists. This operation became one of the most daring and illustrative actions of Soviet intelligence abroad in the pre-war period. Sudoplatov received personal gratitude from Stalin, and in the corridors of the Lubyanka, his name became a legend. Later, he recalled, "We knew that we were removing a man who was preparing a new war against our country. The decision was made at the top, and my role was to execute." The liquidation of Konovalets decapitated the OUN for years to come, giving rise to splits within the organization and thwarting a series of prepared terrorist attacks. But along with this success made Sudoplatov the primary specialist in surgical liquidations, whose services the Lubyanka would use more than once, including operations against Trotsky and other enemies of the Soviet authorities. Operation Duck, the path to Trotsky. After the liquidation of Konovalets, the name of Pavel Sudoplatov was finally consolidated in the list of agents of special purpose. In the Lubyanka, they trusted him so much that they began to initiate him into the most closed projects of Soviet intelligence. One of them concerned the former associate of Lenin, the primary critic of the Stalinist regime, Leon Trotsky, who after his exile from the USSR settled in Mexico, continuing to publish newspapers, issue pamphlets, and prepare political conspiracies against Stalin. In the beginning of the year 1939, Stalin, at one of the meetings of the Politburo, pronounced a short phrase: "As long as he lives, the war with him shall not end." No official order was given, but Lavrenti Beria soon relayed an instruction to Sudoplatov: develop an operation for the physical removal of Trotsky. Within the NKVD, the project received the codename Duck. First of all, a long preparation began. Through the channels of the residencies in Europe and the USA, information was gathered regarding the routes of Trotsky's movements, his guards, his connections, and his inner circle. Sudoplatov personally controlled the agency network in Paris, Marseille, and New York, where illegals worked under the cover of journalists and book merchants. The task was not simply to find the target, but also to create a legend for the infiltration into Trotsky's close circle of a person ready to deliver a fatal blow. By the end of 1939, a candidate appeared: the Spanish communist Ramon Mercader, a participant in the Civil War in Spain, recruited by Soviet intelligence back in Barcelona. Mercader was distinguished by his discipline and devotion to the cause, and most importantly, his readiness to die if the operation required a sacrifice. Sudoplatov developed a multi-stage plan of infiltration. Through fictitious acquaintances and romantic connections, Mercader was introduced to Natalia Sedova, Trotsky's wife, and through her, he gained the trust of the revolutionaries' family. Simultaneously, another group of the NKVD operated in Mexico, engaged in monitoring Trotsky's house in Coyoacan, mapping all entrances, escape routes, and the security system. From Moscow, ciphergrams regularly arrived with new instructions, and Sudoplatov personally coordinated each of them with Beria. Special attention was paid to the murder weapon. According to the recollections of Sudoplatov himself, the use of a pistol with a silencer was initially discussed, but Stalin categorically rejected the option of shooting. Let him die quietly, without a shot. Then the ice axe was chosen, an instrument that leaves no bullet traces and symbolically reminds one of proletarian labor. In one of the safes of the Lubyanka, the blueprints of a modified ice axe with a shortened handle, manufactured specifically for this operation, are still kept. In March of 1940, Stalin demanded to speed up the preparation, fearing that Trotsky would organize a Fourth International aimed at undermining the USSR from within. Sudoplatov, in his memoirs, wrote, "We understood that this decision was not up for discussion. We had an order, not a moral dilemma." In May of 1940, the first attempt at liquidation failed. A group of armed militants connected with the Mexican Communist Party and supported by the NKVD burst into Trotsky's house and fired upon the bedroom. But the master miraculously remained alive. The failure made Moscow nervous, and Beria gave Sudoplatov a final deadline. The operation must conclude no later than the summer. All efforts were thrown behind Mercader. He became close to Trotsky's secretary, offered help in working on political articles, and regularly visited the house. Sudoplatov, through front persons, provided him with documents, money, and even a legend of origin as a Belgian aristocrat. Each meeting with Trotsky was analyzed in detail. An escape plan was developed, and variants of the agent's evacuation after the strike were discussed. In the summer of 1940, the preparation reached its finale. In one of the safe houses in Paris, Sudoplatov personally instructed Mercader. "The main thing is confidence and the absence of fear. Everything else is secondary." He understood that the operation might fail, but the order was unambiguous. The removal of Trotsky was a matter of time and principle. In the end of August, Sudoplatov sent the final ciphergram from Moscow to Mexico with the code word "Ready." The murder was to become the final point in the history of the exile and show the enemies of the USSR that they could be reached in any corner of the world. An ice axe for the revolution. August the 20th, 1940. Mexico City, Coyoacan District. The sun slowly inclined toward the sunset, but the heat did not subside. In the house at number 37, on Avenida Vienna, Coyoacan, Leon Trotsky was working on another article about Stalinism as a betrayal of socialism. Behind his back hung a map of Europe with marked fronts of the Second World War. He was calm, but he did not know that on this day, history would turn into a new bloody chapter. Ramon Mercader, acting under the name Jacques Mornard, arrived at the house at about 1630. He brought with him sketches of an article allegedly needing correction by Trotsky. Under his cloak, he hid a modified ice axe, shortened, with a wrapped handle and a sharpened end. On the previous day, Sudoplatov personally gave him the final instructions over a cipher line from Paris, emphasizing, "Everything must look like an accident or a burst of madness. The main thing is to avoid shooting." In the house were guards and several secretaries. According to the plan, Mercader was to enter unhindered, as he was considered a trusted friend of the family. At about 1640, he found himself in Trotsky's study. The revolutionary, dressed in a light linen shirt, sat at a massive writing desk reading the brought papers. The seconds stretched out painfully long. Mercader stood behind, trying to suppress the trembling in his hands. According to his recollections, at that moment, he heard only his own breathing and the ticking of the wall clock. At 20 minutes past 4, when Trotsky leaned closer to the documents, the agent took a step forward and brought the ice axe down on the head of the victim. The strike was not instantly fatal. The ice axe plunged into the skull, but Trotsky, manifesting incredible strength of will, let out a loud cry and turned toward the attacker. A short but desperate struggle ensued. According to the version of eyewitnesses, Trotsky managed to grab Mercader by the arm and shout in Spanish, "This man wants to kill me." The guards ran in. They knocked the ice axe away and beat the attacker until he lost consciousness. Trotsky was immediately taken to the Cruz Verde hospital, where doctors began the most complex operation to remove the weapon from his head. The surgeons worked for 8 hours, but the injuries proved to be too severe. On the next morning, August the 21st, 1940, at 21:20 local time, Leon Trotsky passed away without regaining consciousness. Mercader was arrested on the spot. During interrogation, he stubbornly maintained that he acted for personal motives. No direct evidence pointing to a connection with Moscow was discovered. Sudoplatov later wrote that the preparation of the legend was so thorough that even the Mexican police, the FBI, and the French secret services could not prove the participation of the NKVD. In the USSR, the operation was deemed brilliantly executed, despite the fact that the murder was not instantaneous. Stalin personally awarded Sudoplatov the Order of Lenin and promised special trust in the future. In the closed archives of the NKVD, telegrams have been preserved where Beria reported, "The task is fulfilled. The source of the threat is liquidated." Pavel Anatolievich himself subsequently spoke of the ice axe for the revolution as an operation where personal feelings had no significance, only orders and duty to the state. Shadow of War. Special operations in the enemy rear. June the 22nd, 1941. At 4 o'clock in the morning, German artillery opened fire on the Soviet border outposts. The Great Patriotic War began. Already in the first hours, Pavel Sudoplatov, then the head of the Department of Special Assignments of the NKVD, was summoned to Lavrentia Beria. The task was set unambiguously. Organize deep reconnaissance and sabotage in the enemy rear. Deploy a partisan network. Destroy headquarters, warehouses, and communications of the Germans. Sudoplatov headed a secret unit known as Department S. Within his jurisdiction were agent saboteurs trained to destroy bridges, blow up railway trains, and liquidate officers of the enemy. According to some data, it was at his instruction that in July of 1941, more than 30 special groups were dropped into the German rear, consisting of former criminals dressed in the uniform of the Wehrmacht. Their goal was to introduce chaos into the German rear areas, disseminate misinformation, and destroy command points. One of the most famous operations was the infiltration of an agent under the code name Max. He was a former officer of the Polish army, recruited by the NKVD back in the 30s. Max penetrated the headquarters of the rear logistics of Army Group Center and for almost half a year transmitted data to Sudoplatov regarding the movement of German echelons. Thanks to this information, it was possible to conduct dozens of successful acts of sabotage on the railways of Belarus and the Smolensk region. In August of 1941, by the personal order of Sudoplatov, Operation Bridge was conducted. A group of 7 people, armed with explosives of delayed action, blew up a key railway bridge across the Berezino River. As a result, for 2 days, the supply of ammunition to the German troops leading the offensive on Moscow was paralyzed. The German army lost about 20 echelons with fuel and artillery shells. Simultaneously, work was carried out on the creation of partisan detachments. According to archival data, by the end of the autumn of 1941 alone, more than 100 organized partisan groups operated through the line of Sudoplatov. Their actions were cruel and uncompromising. Communication hubs and headquarters of German garrisons were destroyed, and ambushes were arranged on columns with food and equipment. A special role was played by female radio operators, whom Sudoplatov selected personally. Many of them performed missions from which no one returned. In December of 1941, the legendary group Thunder was transferred to the Western Front. According to secret instructions from Sudoplatov, it was to liquidate the German General Franz von Rottkes, who was responsible for the supply of tank divisions. On the night of January the 5th, 1942, the saboteurs penetrated a mansion near Smolensk, where the logistics headquarters was located. The general was killed by a shot at point-blank range, and the archival documents were destroyed. This operation caused panic in the German command and thwarted the preparation for a major offensive on Moscow. Historians later found out that Sudoplatov actively interacted with the military intelligence GRU, coordinating the actions of frontline saboteurs and agents in Europe. In his disposal were money, weapons, and resources without limitations. According to the testimonies of his associates, he could change the fate of an entire sector of the front in a night, giving an order for the liquidation of a key figure of the enemy. Some details of his work are still classified. It is known that it was his department that engaged in the preparation of the project Ghost Army, the goal of which was the creation of false radio broadcasts that misled the Wehrmacht regarding the plans of the Red Army. Sudoplatov later said that the war taught him the main thing. It is not the one who is stronger who wins, but the one who acts imperceptibly, accurately, and mercilessly. Operation Berezino, a radio game against the Abwehr. The autumn of 1944. The Eastern Front was gradually sliding toward the collapse of the Wehrmacht. The Red Army had gone on the offensive, liberating the territories of Belarus and Poland. It was during this period that the Department of Special Assignments of the NKVD, under the leadership of Pavel Sudoplatov, developed one of the most sophisticated and dangerous operations of the counterintelligence of the Great Patriotic War. Operation Berezino. The essence of the operation consisted of creating a fake German army group headquarters, allegedly surrounded in the Belarusian forests. The Soviet secret services wanted to worm their way into the trust of the Abwehr and compel it to send its own reconnaissance groups into the rear of the Red Army, which were then destroyed or turned into double agents. According to archival data, it was Sudoplatov who approved the general plan proposed by the officer of Smersh, Stanislav Vopshasov, a legendary partisan commander. Former officers of the Wehrmacht were selected, those who had crossed over to the side of the Soviet Union, as well as prisoners ready to cooperate in exchange for their lives. In one of the operational notes to Beria, it says, "Comrade Sudoplatov personally controls the legend for the radio game and demands maximum authenticity of the actions of the headquarters." For the operation, an abandoned village near the Berezino River was allocated. There, a false headquarters was deployed with German flags, field communication, maps, and models of artillery. Through radio transmitters, messages went into the rear of the enemy about an allegedly surrounded but active group of German troops in need of help and connections with the Abwehr. The Abwehr swallowed the bait. Within 3 months, the Germans sent more than 10 groups of communication and supply to the non-existent headquarters. Each group fell into the hands of the Soviet secret services. It is known that part of the agents were re-recruited and worked against Germany until the end of the war. Historical documents testify it was Pavel Sudoplatov who directed the final phase of the operation when German intelligence attempted to evacuate the headquarters of the surrounded by aircraft. Soviet fighters under the command of Colonel Savitsky intercepted 2 German Junkers transport planes, destroying them over the marshes. It is believed that thanks to Berezino, the Red Army received invaluable information regarding the plans for German counteroffensives and the structure of the Abwehr network on the Eastern Front. German intelligence lost dozens of experienced agents and radio stations. The memoirs of Sudoplatov contain a short entry about this operation. "We made them believe in their victory, where there was not a single soldier. War is not only about weapons, it is a game of minds." According to the officers of Smersh, Operation Berezino is still considered a standard of the radio game, and an example of how secret services can turn an enemy into a source of their own victory. The liquidation of Yevhen Konovalets. Operation in Rotterdam. The spring of 1938. Europe is balancing on the brink of a new major war. Nazi Germany is intensifying its influence in Eastern Europe, and in the shadow of the German special services, émigré terrorist organizations hostile to the Soviet Union are strengthening. Among them is the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, headed by Yevhen Konovalets. Konovalets was not simply a political émigré, but an experienced militant, a veteran of war, and the creator of an entire network of underground cells that operated on the territory of the USSR. According to NKVD data, his agents participated in the preparation of sabotage and the murder of Soviet diplomats, and planned major terrorist attacks in Ukraine. In the Kremlin, the decision was made. Remove Konovalets, but do it so that the traces lead anywhere but to Moscow. The young but already proven Pavel Sudoplatov was chosen as the executor of this dangerous mission. He was given the legend of a convinced Ukrainian nationalist, dissatisfied with the Soviet authorities. Under this cover, he for several months established contacts with members of the OUN in Europe, and then personally met with Konovalets. Sudoplatov recalled, "He was cautious, distrustful, but vain. He loved to be considered the leader of the liberation movement. This was exploited. In Moscow, they developed a plan that would later be called the Operation of the Century. The special services manufactured a gift box with handmade candies, inside of which was camouflaged an explosive mechanism with a clockwork detonator. Sudoplatov received the order to deliver it to Konovalets during a personal meeting. May 23, 1938. Rotterdam, a cafe on Kalverstraat Street. Sudoplatov comes to the meeting, behaves calmly, discusses with Konovalets the plans for the struggle for the independence of Ukraine, and delivers the box as a sign of gratitude. After several minutes, they bid farewell. 20 minutes later, an explosion thundered. Yevhen Konovalets perished on the spot. His body was mutilated by the blast wave. According to the official version of the Dutch police, it was an assassination connected with internal squabbles in Ukrainian nationalist circles. The investigation led to a dead end, and no one could prove the involvement of Moscow. Stalin personally awarded Sudoplatov the Order of Lenin and increased his status in the structure of the NKVD. Pavel himself later said, "I was 27 years old. I understood that I was crossing a boundary beyond which there was no return. But we had no choice. Either he or dozens of our people would perish from his terrorist attacks." The operation in Rotterdam became one of the most famous and daring liquidations in the history of the Soviet secret services, placing Pavel Sudoplatov in the row of the best operatives of the era. Sudoplatov's secret operations on the eve of the war. The end of the 1930s. Europe is sliding toward catastrophe. Nazi Germany is intensifying its reconnaissance networks in the Baltic, Poland, and Ukraine. The Soviet Union is preparing for an inevitable war, but information regarding Hitler's plans is catastrophically lacking. Pavel Sudoplatov, after the success of the operation in Rotterdam, becomes a confidant of the People's Commissar for Internal Affairs, Lavrentiy Beria. To him, they entrust the most risky missions, those which required not only the experience of an agent, but also the ability to act at the junction of diplomacy, reconnaissance, and sabotage. According to the data of declassified archives, it was Sudoplatov who headed a series of secret operations in Poland and Lithuania in 1939 and 1940. The tasks included the recruitment of officers of the Polish army, who after the defeat of Poland found themselves in prisoner-of-war camps, the infiltration of agents into émigré anti-Soviet centers, and the interception of communication channels between German intelligence and Ukrainian nationalists. Sudoplatov personally supervised the work with the agent Harpoon, an officer of the Polish counterintelligence, who delivered to Moscow the first information regarding the creation in Warsaw of an underground network collaborating with the Gestapo. Thanks to this information, the Chekists managed to thwart a sabotage plan on the railway hubs in Belarus. Simultaneously, Sudoplatov participated in operations for the extraction of Soviet agents from countries where the hunt for communists had begun. In particular, the archives mention Operation Fog conducted in Riga. Sudoplatov, under the guise of a commercial representative, directed the evacuation of 24 agents whom the Gestapo was preparing to arrest. Yet another direction of his work was the monitoring of German diplomats in the Baltic countries. Sudoplatov personally organized the installation of hidden microphones in the residence of the German consul in Kaunas, thanks to which Moscow received the first data regarding the preparation of the Wehrmacht for an operation against the USSR. According to the recollections of Pavel Anatolievich, it was in this period that he finally understood that the border between peace and war had already been erased. He wrote, "We lived in a state of the front, only without shots. Any failure could become the beginning of a great war, and any successful operation, a delay of the inevitable." In the spring of 1941, Sudoplatov was directed to Berlin under the cover of an employee of the Soviet embassy. His task was to verify information about the regrouping of the Wehrmacht at the borders of the USSR. It was he who delivered to Moscow the data confirming the preparation of a large-scale invasion. Although in the Kremlin many still believed in the non-aggression pact, this information subsequently became part of a secret report that lay on Stalin's desk several weeks before the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. But, as we know, the leadership of the country until the last moment hoped to avoid the conflict. Sudoplatov's operations on the eve of the war played an enormous role in understanding the real intentions of the Third Reich. But the political will for their use at that time proved insufficient. Pavel himself recalled that it was then he first felt the impotence of intelligence before the closed doors of high-level studies. Sudoplatov and the birth of partisan warfare. The summer of 1941 became a catastrophe for the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht, moving with a swift lightning strike, captured city after city, destroying defense plans and leaving behind hundreds of thousands of prisoners. In these days, when the Red Army was forced to retreat, a mission that was invisible but extremely important fell upon the shoulders of the NKVD organs. The creation in the enemy rear of a network of partisan groups that could destroy the communications of the enemy and destroy its headquarters and supplies. Pavel Sudoplatov found himself in the center of this secret war. By order of Beria, he headed the work for the formation of special sabotage units, future partisan headquarters, which were dropped behind the front line. It was his department that developed the plans for the organization of sabotage at railway hubs, the blowing up of bridges, the destruction of communication lines, and the liquidation of German commandants in occupied cities. From declassified documents, it is known that already in July of 1941, Sudoplatov headed a group of special purpose, which included the most experienced Chekists and fighters from among the graduates of intelligence schools. Preparation was conducted in incredibly compressed time frames. Often in a week, the fighters were taught demolition work, orientation, conspiracy, and psychological resilience to interrogation. One of the first successes was the creation of the locomotive war, a series of acts of sabotage on the railway lines, along which trains with German equipment and ammunition were moving. Sudoplatov personally directed the development of new types of explosive devices with delayed action, which could be installed under the sleepers and go off hours or even days after installation. These mines were frequently delivered from Moscow by aircraft and dropped in designated areas for partisan detachments. One of the most famous operations of this period was the liquidation in Vitebsk of Gauleiter Karl Wittel. The plan was prepared over 3 weeks, and 4 scouts from the unit of Sudoplatov participated in it. Wittel was considered the primary organizer of punitive operations against the peaceful population, and his removal became a symbol of retribution and a signal for other collaborators. According to Pavel Anatolievich himself, the primary problem of the first months of the war was the lack of coordination. Many partisan groups acted spontaneously, without connection to the center, which led to heavy losses. He recalled, "We literally, on our knees, created a control network. Radio operators, liaisons, couriers. Every day someone did not return, but the system gradually began to work." In addition to sabotage, the department of Sudoplatov engaged in the preparation of agents for penetration into German headquarters and local governing bodies. Among them were female agents whom they specially trained to behave like local residents so that, under the guise of laundresses or saleswomen, they could relay information regarding the movement of German troops. By the autumn of 1942, the scale of the partisan war had grown so much that the German command was forced to allocate entire divisions for the struggle against the detachments in the rear. In the reports of the Wehrmacht of that time, it was noted that Russian saboteurs are paralyzing our communications, and no measures of terror are helping. Sudoplatov became one of the architects of this invisible army. He developed the foundations of partisan strategy, which were then used until the end of the war. Mobile detachments, a branched agency network, sabotage with minimal losses, and most importantly, the ideological preparation of fighters who had to know that retribution for the enemy followed specifically from them. Later, in his memoirs, he wrote, "War in the rear is the dirtiest, the hardest. There are no parades and awards there. There is only blood, smoke, and the constant fear of failure." Shadows of retribution. The first liquidations in occupied Europe. Pavel Sudoplatov, heading the special units of the NKVD, already from the first months of the Great Patriotic War, understood that sabotage and reconnaissance were only part of the hidden war. The enemy had to feel that on the captured land, his life was always hanging by a thread. The preparation began for operations of surgical liquidations of key figures of the Nazi administration, Gauleiters, generals, and Gestapo agents. According to declassified archives, it is known that in August of 1941, Sudoplatov personally approved the first plan of the liquidation of a German officer of high rank on the territory of Ukraine. The subject was Major General Walter von Braun, appointed as the commandant of the city of Rivne and responsible for the mass shootings of peaceful residents and Jews. For the execution of the operation, a detachment of 6 people was created, and the leader was an agent under the pseudonym Orlov. The group for several weeks gathered data. It studied the routes of the general's movements, the security system, the schedule of his visits to the headquarters and his house. According to the recollections of participants, the plan was brought to perfection. From fake German passes to the uniform manufactured in the underground workshops of the NKVD. The liquidation took place early in the morning of September the 26th. Orlov and 2 fighters under the guise of German liaisons penetrated the command headquarters, where the general usually met with staff officers. When von Braun entered the study, 3 shots rang out from a Walther pistol with a silencer. The agents managed to leave unnoticed through an underground passage connected with the sewer. This operation became one of the first successful liquidations of a German commander and caused panic among the occupation authorities. Already within a day, command posts all across Ukraine were reinforced with guards, and the Gestapo received the order to identify the Russian killers. The next target of Sudoplatov was the Gauleiter of Minsk, Wilhelm Kube. It was he who was the primary organizer of the mass executions of Jews, partisans, and Soviet prisoners of war. Sudoplatov personally supervised the preparation of the assassination, and the executors were Belarusian underground workers and the NKVD agent, Elena Mazanik. Over the course of several weeks, Elena, who worked as a maid in the house of Kube, observed his habits. The information was relayed to Moscow through a chain of liaisons, and it was Sudoplatov who developed the plan for the final phase of the operation. The decision was made to install a delayed action mine under Kube's mattress. In the night of September the 26th, 1943, an explosion thundered in his bedroom, tearing the Gauleiter apart on the spot. This liquidation became a symbolic victory for the Soviet secret services. During the entire war, this was the first case when a high-ranking representative of the Reich was destroyed right in his residence. Sudoplatov later wrote, "This operation showed the Germans that we would get to everyone who brought death to our land. No one shall hide either behind guards or behind the stars on their shoulder straps. No less important was the operation for the removal of Hauptmann Karl Strauch, the head of a Sonderkommando that conducted punitive raids in the Bryansk forests. Sudoplatov personally directed one of the best sabotage groups there, armed not only with weapons, but also with a radio transmitter for coordinating actions with Moscow. In the night of November the 8th, 1942, the partisans arranged an ambush, destroying the guards and Strauch himself. After this, the activity of the German punitive forces in this area noticeably declined. Historians note that it was specifically under the leadership of Sudoplatov that the system of systematic surgical strikes against enemy officers was created. If earlier, the partisan war consisted of the blowing up of bridges and echelons, now it became an instrument of psychological pressure. Every Gauleiter, every division commander knew that invisible hands were hunting them. Special fear was instilled by sleeper agents. People dropped into cities under the guise of local residents, who for months waited for the order to commit a murder of a key figure. These operations took place under the seal of special importance, and only proven fighters who had undergone preparation personally under the leadership of Pavel Anatolievich participated in them. Operations of retribution, Europe after the war, and the hunt for traitors. The victory of the Soviet Union in the Great Patriotic War did not mean the end of the work for the special groups of the NKVD and subsequent MGB, which were led by Pavel Sudoplatov. Frontline liquidations were replaced by secret hunts for those who had managed to hide in the chaos of the Reich's capitulation, immigrated under false names, or concluded deals with Western secret services. According to Sudoplatov himself, published in his memoirs only partially in the first post-war years, more than 20 plans were approved for the neutralization of collaborators and former Gestapo agents responsible for punitive operations on Soviet territory. Many of these people enjoyed the protection of the secret services of the USA and Great Britain, who strove to use the experience of Nazi specialists in the future struggle against the USSR. The liquidation of Nikolai Kuznetsov and the cleansing of agency in Germany. One of the first tasks of Sudoplatov was the closing of the affairs of the remaining field residencies of the German secret services in the Soviet zone of occupation in Germany. Some of these agents represented a threat because they could destabilize the situation in Eastern Europe. In the archives, it is indicated that a group under the leadership of Sudoplatov conducted no fewer than 6 successful liquidations in Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden in the period from 1945 to 1947. One of the most famous cases was the operation against a former officer of the Abwehr, hiding under the name Heinrich Lange, who during the war had directed punitive actions in Kiev and Vinnytsia. The agent was discovered in the British zone and then moved to Berlin, where his transfer to the east proved impossible for political reasons. In May of 1946, a special group liquidated Lange, staging a robbery. Operation against the Black Legions in the Balkans. No less complex was the task of hunting members of the punitive battalions of the Black Legions, formed from Yugoslav and Croatian collaborators who served on the side of the Wehrmacht. These groups attempted to go underground after the capitulation of Germany, and part of them took up the smuggling of weapons and people to countries of Latin America. By the personal order of Sudoplatov, a special group was created and sent to Vienna and Bratislava for the destruction of the leaders of the legions. Of the 6 stated targets, 5 of the 6 were removed between November 1946 and February 1947. One managed to be captured alive and brought to Moscow for interrogation. The liquidation of Bandera. A separate chapter of Sudoplatov's work. The removal of the leaders of Ukrainian nationalists acting from abroad. Stepan Bandera, hiding in Munich under the protection of Western secret services, was for a long time the primary target of the NKVD and later the MGB. The plan of the operation was developed over several years, with the involvement of deeply undercover agents in the Ukrainian émigré environment. In the year 1959, the special agent Bohdan Stashinsky, trained in the unit of Sudoplatov, received the assignment for the liquidation of Bandera with the use of a spray gun firing potassium cyanide. On October the 25th, Bandera was killed at the entrance of his own house. Officially, the operation was classified for decades, but its planning and technical support went specifically through the structure created by Sudoplatov back in the years of the war. The Moscow List. Failed and controversial operations. Historians still argue about the existence of the so-called Moscow List, a list of approximately 30 targets subject to destruction in Europe and South America. According to some data, it included former officers of the SS involved in genocide, as well as several former Soviet citizens who had crossed to the side of the enemy and participated in punitive actions. It is known that at least 5 operations from this list did not take place because of the failure of the agency network or political decisions by Moscow. For example, the plan of the assassination attempt on Otto Skorzeny, the famous commando of the Reich, was cancelled after his agreement on cooperation with the CYA. Conclusion: the role of Sudoplatov in the secret war after the war. These operations finally secured for Pavel Sudoplatov the reputation of a man of retribution, an officer who knew how to find enemies where, seemingly, they had disappeared forever. His units acted far beyond the borders of the USSR, using fake passports, complex conspiratorial routes, explosive devices, and toxic substances, remaining invisible and deadly dangerous. Today, many documents from those years remain classified, and only separate episodes become known thanks to the declassification of archives and the memoirs of participants. But it is already clear: the contribution of Sudoplatov to the formation of the Soviet system of special operations was colossal, and the model of surgical liquidations created by him is studied to this day by the secret services of different countries. Epilogue. Shadows of the Invisible War. The secret operations of Pavel Sudoplatov. The name of Pavel Sudoplatov always surrounded a veil of mystery. Even after his death in the middle of the 90s of the last century and the release of his memoirs, many questions remained without an answer. Who in reality gave the orders for the most famous liquidations? How deep did the special groups of the NKVD and MGB penetrate into the ranks of foreign secret services? And did some operations attributed to Sudoplatov really go beyond the framework of official state necessity? Operation Bear's Paw. The secret war in Spain. According to unconfirmed data, already at the end of the 30s, the unit subordinate to Sudoplatov hunted former white émigrés and supporters of Trotsky in Spain, acting under the cover of the international brigades. Allegedly, the group liquidated several double agents who collaborated with British intelligence and simultaneously supplied the German Abwehr with information about Soviet military advisors. Officially, such operations were never recognized, but documents found in the archives of Madrid point to the participation of unidentified Soviet agents in the mysterious vanishings of at least 5 former participants of the White Movement in Barcelona and Valencia. The long arm of Moscow. The hunt for defectors in Latin America. After the war, some officers of the Wehrmacht and agents of the Gestapo settled in Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, where Western secret services organized new legends for them. There exists a version that already at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s, Sudoplatov directed agents there for the collection of information and the liquidation of separate individuals involved in mass massacres on the territory of the USSR. Historians find indirect confirmations of these rumors. In Buenos Aires and Montevideo in the 50s, several mysterious deaths of former SS men and collaborators occurred, and in 3 cases, the killer used a rare Soviet weapon, a modified TT pistol with a silencer, not encountered in the West. The Black List of the Atomic Project. The most controversial of the versions concerns the role of Sudoplatov in ensuring the security of the Soviet atomic project. According to the recollections of some employees of the First Main Directorate, there existed a so-called Black List of foreign specialists and former Soviet physicists who collaborated with the USA and Great Britain. According to unconfirmed information, at the end of the 40s, no fewer than 3 accidents were conducted with people who attempted to transmit data regarding the nuclear programs of the USSR abroad. These operations were allegedly supervised specifically by Sudoplatov, being the link between Beria and the foreign intelligence. But there is no proof of this. The documents are either destroyed or are still classified. The death of Roman Suvorov. Liquidation or coincidence. In the middle of the 50s, Roman Suvorov, a former officer of the ROA, who publicly promised to transmit to Western Secret Services information regarding the secret murders organized by Sudoplatov in the 30s, was found dead in Paris. His death was officially recognized as a heart attack. However, journalists later discovered in the reports of the French police mentions of 2 unknown men who observed Suvorov's house shortly before the tragedy. The rumors that this was a special operation of the MGB were never refuted. Closed archives and the secret of Sudoplatov. Even after decades, a large part of the dossier of Pavel Sudoplatov remains under the seal of not subject to disclosure. Many historians are certain part of his operations will never be officially recognized because they concerned people and organizations that collaborated with the Nazis as well as with Western intelligence after the war. Only rare memoirs, fragments of dispatches, and indirect evidence allow one today to see the scale of the work of a man who was called behind his back the surgeon of the secret services. Precise, cool-headed, acting without the right to a mistake. His real biography is much broader than what is known officially. And it means that Pavel Sudoplatov lives in the memory of the archives, in the whisper of old safe houses, and in the shadow of those who knew how to solve problems quietly. He seemingly departed, but in reality simply changed his meeting place. Perhaps his legacy still lingers in the quiet corridors of intelligence services, as if asking, "Well now, guys, do you still call this intelligence?" Stories about him are a mixture of reality and legends. And if one believes the rumors, his methods are still studied inside intelligence academies and security services around the world. To correct the plans of operations and quietly whisper. In intelligence, hesitation can be fatal. And if you want to know more such stories, subscribe to the channel, put a like, and hit the bell. If you enjoy deep historical investigations like this one. He knew the primary rule after all. In the world of intelligence, those who ignore the signs rarely survive the endgame.